Good morning, everybody. Today's webinar is part of the Copernico Capital Partners series of webinars focused on Venezuela. The objective of the Venezuela series is to develop a better understanding of a very complex situation and to share and discuss different views and ideas with the public in general. My name is Jorge Piedrahita, and I am the moderator of today's event. During the event, our speaker will share his thoughts for about 25 minutes or so, and that will be followed by about 15 to 20 minutes of questions and answers, maybe a little more depending. So I will ask attendants to submit your questions through the chat feature in the Zoom application. Having said that, it is a great pleasure and privilege for me to introduce our speaker today, Ambassador William Brownfield. Ambassador Brownfield has had a long and very distinguished career as a foreign service officer within the US State Department. His career started in 1979 in Maracaibo, Venezuela, and his earlier assignments have included numerous postings overseas, including Switzerland, Argentina, El Salvador, Panama, and other Latin American countries. During the last 2 decades, he has had a first-row seat to the many changes in Latin America. Ambassador Brownfield was the US ambassador to Chile between 2002 and 2004, the US ambassador to Venezuela between 2004 and 2007, the US ambassador to Colombia between 2007 and 2010, and more recently, Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs between 2011 and 2017. In Venezuela, Mr. Brownfield had the honor to be publicly threatened with expulsion 8 times by Hugo Chavez, but the gentleman never pulled the plug. In Colombia, he led the US efforts supporting the 2008 Jack rescue operation that ended freeing 15 American, Colombian, and French hostages from jungle captivity. Ambassador Brownfield has received the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award and was a 3-time recipient of the Presidential Performance Award. Brownfield has been a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies since 2008 and a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center since 2021. He's a graduate of Cornell University and the National War College and attended the University of Texas School of Law. He is fluent in Spanish and French. Without further ado, let me turn the stage to Ambassador Brownfield. Ambassador, please go ahead.
Thank you, Don Jorge. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Muy buenos días, señoras y señores. Thank you for that little trip through my childhood. You have succeeded in making me feel very old and decrepit, but nevertheless, I shall try to offer some value in terms of my comments and suggestions in the course of the next hour. To begin with, and just to put everyone at their ease, since Jorge has introduced me in English, I will speak in English. When we get to questions and answers, obviously, if a question is posed to me in the English language, I shall speak in the English language. I speak it perfectly well. Pero si alguien me hace pregunta en español, voy a responder en español. Pero no voy a servir como intérprete. I will not serve as your interpreter. You will get me either in English or in Spanish, but not both. Ladies and gentlemen, my topic for today is US foreign policy toward Venezuela. And to offer this presentation in a coherent manner, I have to go back with you in time about 23 years in order to put current policy in perspective. And the way I will do it will be to summarize very briefly, I promise, every US presidential administration since Bill Clinton in terms of their policy toward and with Venezuela. Let me begin. Mr. Hugo Chávez Frías, que en paz descanse, en ese gran paraíso socialista en el cielo, Mr. Chávez came to office in January of 1999. Bill Clinton was the president of the United States at that time. Mr. Clinton, you may recall, was a Democrat, a member of the US Democratic Party, and he followed the same policy that every Democratic president in the United States of America, at least since Jimmy Carter, and perhaps all the way back to John F. Kennedy, each Democrat, when dealing with a leftist or left of center president in Latin America, starts with the assumption that they can make common cause together because the Democrats are the left of center party in the United States. So by definition, they have common ground with the left of center government in Latin America. It has never worked, but each such Democratic US president has had to learn that lesson. The Clinton administration learned the lesson in Venezuela at the end of 1999, when some of you may recall, Venezuela suffered some tragic mudslides brought on by flooding at the end of the year, which killed several hundred people and literally destroyed several communities along the mountain ridge line that separates Caracas from the Caribbean Sea. The United States government at this time put together a US assistance package that was put into 2 ships, and the ships put into port in Maiquetía, Caracas's principal port, and President Hugo Chavez denied them landing and sent them away. It became clear at that point that from Mr. Chavez's perspective, having an adversarial relationship with the United States was more important than whatever assistance he might receive from the United States. That then takes us to January of 2001. The new president of the United States was George W. Bush. George Bush actually had a clearer understanding, I suggest, of Mr. Chavez and his government than the Clinton administration did before him. Mr. Bush believed, I know this because he told me so several times, that Hugo Chavez probably represented the most dangerous threat to democracy and stability in all of Latin America during his 8 years. And the Bush administration developed a policy that we have come to call smart confrontation. Confrontation meaning that we had 2 competing systems, and they were going to clash in terms of offering their differing views and visions for the future, but smart in terms of avoiding direct confrontation. And what developed was basically a 4-track policy. First, to preserve what in those days were still the 2 principal US interests in Venezuela: cooperation on drugs and cooperation on oil and gas. Second, to penetrate Hugo Chavez's popular base, which is to say the poor communities, the barrios in Caracas and the other big cities, the poor communities in the rural areas, and try to show in those communities that overwhelmingly supported Hugo Chavez at this time, that the United States actually had similar culture, similar approach. At times we called it baseball diplomacy, the game that unites, if you will, the people of the United States and the people of Venezuela. Our third track in this 4-track policy was to encourage divisions within Chavismo. And we could do this in any number of ways, to say good things about some members of Chavismo, bad things about others, which makes the one somewhat suspicious of the other. to bring indictments against one or two members of Chavismo, but not against others that they knew were involved in exactly the same things. To criticize some, but not criticize others, anything that would generate some degree of suspicion, we thought at the time was a good idea. And the fourth element, or the fourth track, was literally to avoid direct confrontation. And how did we do it? I can assure you all that during 8 years as President of the United States, George W. Bush never once in public mentioned Hugo Chavez by name. I tried to do the exact same thing. If we were critical, we would be critical of the government. We would be critical of certain policies, but we would try very hard not to personalize it. By the way, I believe this drove Mr. Chavez absolutely crazy during his 8 years of coexistence on this planet with George Bush. But that then takes us to January of 2009. The United States has a new president. It is Barack Obama. Barack Obama, some of you will recall, was also a Democrat, and to a certain extent fell into the same trap that his previous Democrat presidents had fallen into, and that is to somehow think he had common cause with Hugo Chavez, not realizing first that from Mr. Chavez's perspective, having an adversarial relationship with the United States was not just in his political interest, it was a political necessity. Second, a Latin American leftist starts from a position on the pendulum much further to the left than does a member of the US Democratic Party. And third, just as a matter of history and tradition, not to mention education, the Latin American leftist tends to perceive what is happening in Latin America in some way as a cause and effect with the United States of America, and therefore is not naturally inclined to have a positive relationship. Mr. Obama concludes then that because neither the Clinton approach of reach out and try to work together, nor the Bush approach of smart confrontation has produced any fundamental change or positive change in US-Venezuela relations, he will try to ignore Hugo Chavez and keep him at arm's length, basically accepting that Chavez is not necessarily good news for democracy in Latin America, but by the same token, trying to avoid making the United States a target for Mr. Chavez during his years in office. The policy, of course, did not succeed for the reasons that I've already suggested. Hugo Chavez needed to have the United States as an adversary for his own political and, if you will, ideological reasons. The problem, I would suggest, with the Obama policy was that in 2013, when Mr. Chavez ceased to be the president of the Republic of Venezuela due to his death, the Obama administration was not well positioned to take advantage of this opportunity. A new team coming in, an ability to have some sort of new dialogue, communication, and engagement with the Venezuelan government. But because there was virtually no contact whatsoever, the opportunity passed by. And Mr. Maduro became then, and is now, the president, at least by his standards, of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. In January of 2017, Donald Trump becomes president of the United States. Mr. Trump, of course, is not a member of the Democratic Party and did not approach the Venezuela issue as a matter of trying to make common cause. In fact, I would describe the Trump administration's policy toward Venezuela as one of maximum pressure. And the objective was fairly simple. Apply as much pressure as possible in order to produce, eventually, the departure from office of Nicolás Maduro. Not necessarily an overall change of government from Chavismo, although that that would not have been rejected, but to proceed to pressure Mr. Maduro enough for him to depart from office in some way, shape, or form. How did they do it? First, a conscious policy to recognize an alternative government, which, by the way, the United States of America continues to recognize to this day through the Venezuelan Constitution, written, promulgated, and strongly supported by the late President Hugo Chavez in the year 1999 and 2000, which said, in a sense, if the office of the presidency was vacated or vacant, the president of the National Assembly would assume the office until such time as free and fair elections could be held. And on that basis, Juan Guaido was named by the National Assembly as the interim president of Venezuela and received the recognition by the government of the United States of America. The second element of the policy was sanctions, increasingly severe sanctions, economic in nature, first against specific individuals, and then against larger organizations or businesses, culminating eventually in the sanctions against PDVSA, the Venezuelan National Oil Company, and any entity that would formally do business with them. The third element was criminal indictments, arrests, and convictions of Venezuelan government officials on any matter in which their activity fell within US judicial jurisdiction. In most cases, this involved matters of drug trafficking to the United States of America, but there were others under different laws that involved degrees of corruption, money laundering, and other crimes of that nature. And fourth and finally, maximum pressure envisioned more international engagement, specifically the European Union and its member states, and a group at one time of 14 governments from the Western Hemisphere, starting as far north as Canada and extending as far south as Argentina and Chile in the so-called Lima Group, attempting to coordinate on a regional basis on their policies, united to some extent by the fact that by the year 2020, millions of Venezuelan citizens had become refugees, and they in turn had become something of a burden, or at least a political issue, for almost every major nation in the Western Hemisphere. Once again, from as far north as Canada to as far south as Chile and Argentina. That was maximum pressure. Did it succeed? Obviously not, because Nicolás Maduro is still in office, the exact same office where he was in Venezuela at the time that the Trump administration came to office. That in and of itself, by the way, I submit, is not an indication of failure. If failure to produce a final positive result in 4 years is automatically a failed policy, then I suppose on that same logic, we could stop prosecuting people for murder, because after all, we've had a policy to discourage murder for more than 4,000 years as of recorded history, and people still murder. The Trump administration policy obviously did not work fully, but to say that it was a complete failure is probably an overstatement. And that in turn brings me at long last to the current US administration. The president of the United States for the past 2 years, or almost 2 years, is Joe Biden. Mr. Biden, of course, to remind you all, is a Democrat. And of course, like all Democrats, he wants to find a way to work with or get along with a leftist government in Latin America. He came to office, as did his team, with extreme frustration at the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy and a determination to change that policy. In fact, if I had to put a name to the Biden administration policy toward Venezuela, at least now, it would be, I would call it the anything but Trump administration policy. Now, that's not a very clear policy, of course. And at the end of the day, if I can find one single common theme that goes through all the public declarations by the Biden administration and private discussions, it would probably be dialogue, driving toward dialogue between the Democratic opposition, or as they, in their view, correctly say, the interim constitutional government of Venezuela. In other words, the opposition that is controlled by, or at least influenced by Juan Guaido, and the Maduro government, or as the opposition would say, the regime in Venezuela. And how this has played out over the last 2 years, at least in my opinion, is more or less as follows. First, increasing pressure by the Biden administration on Juan Guaido and the larger opposition structure to agree to and engage in dialogue with the Maduro regime or government, and specifically the dialogue that is now, well, to some extent, on and off, being hosted by the Mexican government and President Lopez Obrador, and managed by the Norwegian government and a team of mediators who have been involved on and off in this dialogue effort now for, I believe, 3 years. So some pressure on the Guaido government or organization to engage in dialogue. Second, full support for the Mexico-led efforts. And this is despite the fact that that in the course of the last 20 years, and particularly the last 10 years, there have been at least 4, and by some counts, as many as 14 dialogue efforts, none of which have succeeded. Talk about a rule that if your policy has failed, perhaps you should stop following that policy, but that's a different argument altogether. None of them have succeeded, and from the opposition's perspective, they have emerged from each dialogue effort in the past more divided, with less credibility, and in a weaker position, while the Maduro government has emerged in a stronger position. Nevertheless, the commitment by this administration is to support the dialogue process. Third, and increasingly evident as of last week, some movement towards softening the sanctions that the Trump administration put in place between 2017 and 2021. They have not lifted sanctions per se. They opened the door a crack, as many of you noted last week definitively, when they acknowledged and announced a decision to allow Chevron, a US oil and gas company, to return to Venezuela and continue to do and resume doing some direct Venezuela to US business under some very strict conditions. But nevertheless, the door has been cracked, and it's consistent with the Biden administration's frequent statements that the Trump administration policies did not work, and it is time for a different approach. Fourth, in terms of Biden administration approach, downplay the criminal indictments, arrests, and possible trials. It is not that they have formally withdrawn any indictments. In fact, that's a very complicated process that requires going back to a US court to agree that an indictment will be quashed. But nevertheless, those of you who have been paying attention will note that the Biden administration has not issued any new announcements on indictments or rewards being offered since coming to office in January of 2021. And I suspect I don't only suspect, I know that is a matter of conscious policy. The fifth element of the Biden approach is engaging the international community, but in a different way than the Trump administration did. The Trump administration was trying to work with a like-minded group of governments and nations to increase the pressure on Mr. Maduro, eventually leading to his decision to leave office and allow a more normal democratic process to unfold in Venezuela. The Biden administration's approach is to work again with like-minded governments, but for the purpose of supporting the dialogue that is currently underway, hosted by Mexico and mediated by Norway. And this approach has obviously involved dropping some governments off the list who were more committed, if you will, to the maximum pressure, bringing more governments in, particularly in light of recent election results in Latin America, which have unquestionably brought more governments to office who have, if you will, less of a tendency to be negative toward Mr. Maduro and his government, and a greater tendency to at least be open to some degree of dialogue or communication with them. I would draw your attention to the two most important governments in terms of immediate proximity to Venezuela and Mr. Maduro, and that would be the government of Brazil and the government of Colombia, both of whom have had elections within the last 6 months, each of which has produced a new president, Petro in Colombia, and when inaugurated, Lula da Silva in Brazil, who undoubtedly bring a different approach to Colombia. And may I offer this comment to everyone who is listening right now: if there are any two governments, really any one government in the entire planet that has a right to its own strong position on Venezuela and a right to expect some support for them, it is Colombia, which at this point probably, while they will not admit to this number, but it is probably hosting more than 3 million Venezuelan citizens as refugees in its country right now. They do have a right to an opinion. They do have a right for that opinion to be given very serious and respectful consideration by any other nation in the world, including mine. So that, if you will, is my assessment of where the Biden administration is going. A little bit of pressure on Guaido to do dialogue. Strong support for the dialogue itself. Soften the sanctions policy, although they're noting the Biden administration has not lifted sanctions per se. Downplay criminal indictments and rewards, and engage the international community on the dialogue strategy. But, ladies and gentlemen, may I offer Brownfield's comments on several of these before I wrap this up. First, dialogue is great. Who can oppose dialogue? But the opposition has a point. Mr. Maduro has not, in fact, offered a credible or positive track record on dialogue. He has not kept the commitments that he has made. He has not, in fact, agreed at times even to sit down with opposition dialogue. And using the current dialogue as an example, the dialogue terminated more than a year ago, not because the opposition walked away, not because the United States or any other non-Venezuelan government walked away from the dialogue, but because Mr. Maduro walked away from the dialogue. So we are, if you will, investing virtually all of our eggs in the basket of dialogue without there being a great history of success in dialogue. Second, the suggestion, as the Biden administration has made, that in the event dialogue does not work, sanctions can be snapped back, is probably unrealistic. The fact is even now, a number of companies, US companies and non-US companies, are already seeking the same treatment in terms of lifting of some of the sanctions to allow them to engage in Venezuela, or alternatively, to give them access to Venezuelan assets that are currently in the United States of America. Citgo, the oil company, it comes first to mind, but there are others out there. These issues will eventually go to court in the United States. Once there is a formal judicial process underway, the executive branch, the Biden administration, will actually be enjoined from snapping back sanctions until the judicial process has come to a conclusion. So we should all be honest with ourselves. Sanctions have not yet been dismantled, but the suggestion that they can be snapped back at any point is probably unrealistic. And finally, let us also take into account that this new set of governments in Latin America, and some not so new, but let me just walk you through those that have changed within the last, let's say within the last 2 years or so, last 2 or 3 years. Argentina, Chile, Peru, Brazil, Colombia, and for that matter, Mexico, although Mexico is now approaching its 3rd year. We are talking about a very different group of governments than those that were originally engaged with the maximum pressure policy. But it does mean that the Biden administration is going to find that some of its options, which is to say ways to gradually increase pressure on Mr. Maduro, will not be as viable today as they might have been 2 or 3 years ago. My final conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, is this. I would suggest that the Biden administration has been pursuing over the last 2 years a tactical approach on Venezuela, driven by the determination that they wanted a change from the Trump administration's policy to Venezuela. But they have not at this time reached a very clear consensus in terms of what is their strategic objective. They will say, if pressed, and sometimes even if not pressed, that their objective is a negotiated dialogue that will lead to a solution. But Bill Brownfield says a negotiation is not a strategy. A negotiation is a process. And a negotiation without at least one side of the table having a clear objective, strategic objective in mind, is likely to produce at best an uncertain outcome and at worst a bad outcome. That's my summary. Dr. P, I now return the floor to you. Usted ya tiene la palabra. Do you have your, are you on mute?
Oh, I apologize for that. Let me, thank you very much for your comments. Let me get started with a question more on strategy and strategy kind of in general terms for the region. And this comes from a gentleman in Caracas who basically states that people in Venezuela, and I'd say other countries as well, sometimes feel confused by the US policy. And while he seems to view himself as part of the opposition, in other words, share some common enemies with the US, he basically says that over the last few years, those adversaries and enemies have been getting a stronger position and presence in Venezuela, and feels that the US has just done the opposite, has left Venezuela. In addition to that, his comment states that entrepreneurs are suffering the worst of all wars from sanctions. On the one side, they are hated by the Maduro government, and on the other side, their business is extremely difficult or complicated due to sanctions. So how would you respond to this particular Venezuela? And if you could also provide maybe a quick thought about US strategy for the region in general, because it seems that the US is not paying that much attention to the region, or has not, at least for the last few decades.
Right, Jorge, I see two questions there, and let me, one Venezuela specific and the other more regional, and let me take them in that order. First, the gentleman's comments on US policy in Venezuela, may I say, I'm quite sympathetic to them. I actually agree with almost everything that you have summarized in terms of his comments and his question. He is not, I can assure you, and I can assure him, he is not the only person who is a bit confused on US policy. And that to some extent is why I went through that 20-minute explanation or description of 5 different US presidential administrations and their policies. Because one of the problems, it's not a problem, but one of the complications, if you will, in a democratic nation and a democratic government is that when presidents change, so will the policies. And we went from Bill Clinton, reach out, I want to give Mr. Chavez a big hug, and we're I want to confront this rascal, but I want to do it intelligently. To Barack Obama, I don't wish to be engaged in Venezuela. I want to try to ignore this guy because he's non-democratic and he's annoying. To Trump, which is I'm going to bring as much pressure as I can to bear to get this president to leave. To Biden, whose policy is more or less, we don't know what our strategy is, but we know we don't want to do what Trump did. And therefore, we're going to make some small tactical adjustments, I guess, until we see how the dialogue plays out. Now, is this confusing to someone down in Caracas? Of course it is. I'm in Washington, and it confuses me. And I've been in this business now for more than 40 years. And it is extremely confusing. My own view, ladies and gentlemen, is the gentleman in Caracas is correct. As this policy has developed, as each change occurs in US administration. First, Mr. Chavez, and now Mr. Maduro comes through the process at a minimum surviving, and at times in an even better position. I think Maduro is better now than he was 2 years ago. He's stronger than he was 2 years ago at the end of the Trump administration. I will also say, ladies and gentlemen, I am not a great fan or admirer of Donald Trump. I do believe he is one of the worst presidents that have ever held the office in the United States of America. That said, even a broken clock is correct 1 time a day, 2 times if it's a rotary clock. And I thought that the Trump administration's Venezuela policy at least was thought through. It was a strategy. And they said, our strategy is the departure, our strategic objective is the departure of Nicolas Maduro. And our strategy to get there is to apply pressure on top of pressure on top of pressure, while leaving an opening for some of the Chavista movement to have an off-ramp, an exit ramp, in the event that they get Mr. Maduro out of office. Was it too heavy-handed? Maybe. Was it too confrontational? Probably. Did it fall into many traps, including some of the more absurd public statements made by the 45th president of the United States? Yes, it did all of those things. However, at least it was a strategic approach, something that I think we do not have right now. Finally, before I leave Venezuela, I am also in agreement that the Venezuelan business community is suffering substantially from US and European and others, Canadian and some Latin American sanctions that are applied to Venezuela. Having said that, I offer two comments to the gentleman in Caracas. First, when we started down this road in 2018 and 2019, we actually did talk to opposition leaders and said, really, at the end of the day, you have a right to a veto here. If you do not want these sanctions, we will find a way to apply pressure in some other manner. And they, at that time, and I admit that was 4 years ago, more than 4 years ago, they did not press not to do sanctions. Second, I would suggest to any empresario, any member of the Venezuelan business community, that sanctions, as you well know, are not the only reason why the Venezuelan economy today is a tragedy. It's a danger zone. It is almost non-existent. I believe Mr. Chavez and Mr. Maduro and the policies that their governments have followed and the complete kleptocratic criminalization of the government of Venezuela are far more responsible for the current state of play for the business community than any international sanctions that are applied. Second question, the uncertainty, the concern, the perplexity and confusion about US policy throughout the region. Alas, I probably agree with the gentleman on this point as well. Although on this, I would at least say that on a total hemispheric basis, I think the Biden administration has a better approach to Latin America as a region than did the Trump administration. I would suggest to you that the Trump administration's approach was one, highly personalistic. If he liked the president of a particular country, then he was very sympathetic. I will not name names. You can figure out who some of them were. One, at least recently, I think, lost a presidential election, but there are others out there. Second, he vectored in on Venezuela only because he thought he could produce a result very quickly, which of course did not happen, suggesting that his own analytical process was somewhat flawed. And third, he antagonized our closest neighbor to the south and in a very personal and offensive, in fact, even insulting manner, destroyed our relationship with perhaps our most important Latin American partner, and that is the United States of Mexico, or the United Mexican States. I believe the Biden administration is better at dealing with different countries, different governments, different cultures than was the Trump administration. But I agree with the gentleman in Caracas. I honestly don't believe there's a strategy there. And I wish there were a strategy. Is it trade and development? Is it support for democracy? Give me a theme so I could try to link together what the Biden administration is trying to do in the entire region. And I admit, I do not see it.
Okay, thank you very much. La siguiente es una pregunta en español. La pregunta es si la instalación del Parlamento de oposición en enero sería una mala señal para los Estados Unidos en cuanto al diálogo, dado que incluso un partido como Voluntad Popular, que forma parte del diálogo en México, sería parte de ese Parlamento. Entonces, la pregunta es si esto es una mala señal para los Estados Unidos, y esto es seguido por otra pregunta en español, en donde nos preguntan si los Estados Unidos seguirán reconociendo la administración Guaidó. Por supuesto que no lo sabemos, pero tal vez la pregunta sería, ¿qué sería su recomendación si Biden le preguntara sobre su opinión personal?
Dos preguntas excelentes. Primero, la Asamblea Nacional y su decisión. La Asamblea Nacional, ¿cómo quiero decirlo? la asamblea aceptada por la mayoría de la comunidad como la Asamblea Nacional legítimamente, constitucionalmente elegida. Porque como ustedes bien saben, en otra elección hace 2 años más o menos, una elección que fue rechazada por observadores, por países europeos, por la Unión Europea, por el gobierno de los Estados Unidos, de Canadá, de varios países de América Latina. En este momento aceptamos por falta de otra asamblea abiertamente, transparentemente y legalmente elegida, la Asamblea Nacional llamada la Asamblea Nacional de la Oposición, y aún es la Asamblea Legítima y Constitucional de Venezuela. Ahora bien, estoy 99,9% seguro que esa asamblea va a extenderse por otro año en enero de 2023 por falta de cualquier otra asamblea legal en Venezuela hoy. Va a complicar el proceso de diálogo sin duda alguna, por varias razones. Uno, por supuesto, el distinguidísimo señor Maduro no va a aceptar la prolongación de esa Asamblea Nacional. Va a decir que ya tenemos una Asamblea Nacional que de pura coincidencia tiene una mayoría de como 90% que son chavistas. Estoy absolutamente sorprendido, asombrado en indicar eso. Y Maduro va a decir que no acepto representantes de esa asamblea ilegítima. Dos, esa asamblea prolongada en enero del año que viene, probablemente va a decir que el presidente de la Asamblea Nacional, Juan Guaidó, sigue en su posición y por lo tanto constitucionalmente sigue como el presidente interino, que el señor Maduro no va a aceptar. Y en otras palabras, y finalmente, la administración de Biden tiene el problema de tener que opinar sobre este punto. Es que ellos van a coincidir con la oposición en decir que la Asamblea Nacional de ellos es la auténtica y por lo tanto que Juan Guaidó aún es el presidente interino, o van a coincidir con Maduro que dice que esa asamblea no tiene absolutamente autoridad alguna, constitucional, legal o en cualquier otra manera, y por lo tanto no representa y la oposición no representa esa Asamblea Nacional. Eventualmente, la administración de Biden tendrá que tomar posiciones. Que eso me lleva entonces a esa parte de mi presentación. Cuando hablo de la administración de Biden como un gobierno que tiene tácticas, pero sin tener su objetivo estratégico definido. Y es por eso que van a tener este problema en enero del año que viene. Segunda pregunta, y que hasta cierto punto creo que acabo de responder, la aceptación, el reconocimiento de Juan Guaidó como presidente interino constitucional de la República de Venezuela. Sin duda alguna, va a ser problemático para la administración de Biden durante el año que viene en el proceso de diálogo, por varias razones. La más importante es esta batalla entre Maduro, que rechaza, que dice que Guaidó es nada más que un nefasto gusano y representante del Imperio del Norte, etcétera, etcétera, etcétera. Y la oposición, que también está no tan unificada como era en el año 2018-2019. Y ellos también tienen sus fisuras, como ustedes bien saben. La unidad de la oposición hoy no es lo que tenían ellos hace 4 años. Y la administración Biden tendrá eventualmente que tomar una decisión. En mi humilde opinión, y voy a ofrecer esta opinión para todo el mundo que está escuchando en este momento. Hay gente, incluyendo personas que respeto yo, y respeto sus opiniones y su inteligencia, que dicen que en este momento el gobierno interino de Guaidó no es funcional y deberíamos investigar o apoyar un nuevo sistema. Y mi respuesta siempre es, ok, explíqueme, o si es un amigo, explícame cuál sea el nuevo sistema. ¿Quién es el alternativo? ¿Quién tendrá el apoyo popular y más unánime que Juan Guaidó? Cuando no me diga que Juan Guaidó no es perfecto, acepto eso. Cualquier persona en el mundo no es perfecto. No hemos tenido una persona perfecta desde hace 2022 años y unos meses. Pero si alguien dice que él no es perfecto, por lo tanto, deberíamos rechazarlo, a mí me parece una política totalmente tonta y boba. La idea es, si hay alguien mejor, identifícalo y podemos hablar entonces sobre si eso sería una buena idea, pero solamente decir que, bueno, ella no tiene el apoyo que tenía hace 4 años, para mí es la misma tontería como decir que la ley contra el asesinato no ha funcionado por miles de años y por lo tanto no deberíamos apoyar esa ley contra el asesinato. Es una lógica totalmente absurda. Pero eso es el problema que veo yo en términos del presidente interino constitucional Juan Guaidó durante el proceso que viene del diálogo.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, as we look into the future, and I am going to just mention a couple of things that people are very interested in. One is you stated the fact that snapping back sanctions was not something very realistic. So it seems that the path of least resistance is probably some additional easing of sanctions. So in that sense, if you have to look into the future, what do you think is might happen there? And then a couple of things that people are asking, which are, would the trading ban on securities end? What needs to happen there? At which stage do you expect the U.S. Embassy in Caracas to reopen? And also at the practical level for folks in Venezuela, when are direct flights between the US and Venezuela going to start? So several questions that I just summarized for you in this.
I'll call this the package of sanctions questions. First, my judgment, and by the way, this does not reflect the views of the Biden administration and the executive branch of the United States government. It probably does not reflect the views of a good number of members of Congress, although it does reflect the views, I suspect, of a majority, at least those who have thought through this matter. My view is that what the Biden administration wants to do is crack the door open on sanctions just a little bit, and then see if that will both accomplish some good things here in the United States. It's not going to be a significant amount of oil or gas that comes into the United States, but there will be some, without a doubt. So for a limited period of time, keep this door only partially open. I believe that is what they want to do. I believe they are hopeful that that will contribute, make a positive contribution to the dialogue in the coming year. It is my view, that's what they think. I think it will prove very difficult to keep that door open only a tiny crack. There are too many other companies and business organizations, both in the United States and elsewhere in the world, that are affected by US sanctions. And now that the door is cracked open, they will apply a tremendous amount of pressure, economic pressure, political pressure, eventually legal and judicial pressure, in order to get that cracked door open a little bit wider to incorporate them. It is my belief that if they are unsuccessful with their political or economic arguments, they will probably go to court. And they will make some argument about equal protection under the law. Why does one company receive a benefit but not others? And regardless of what the outcome, while that process is underway, a court will not allow snapback, because in essence, it will say, this is currently under judicial review, and you will not change the reality until we have made our determination. This is why I believe the administration is probably being too optimistic in thinking that they can control completely the speed with which the sanctions are lifted, and in fact, their possibility of snapping those sanctions back into place. Meanwhile, we have several other sanctions issues that you have just noted. In terms of buying and selling, trading, if you will, in securities, U.S. securities being bought or sold or traded to Venezuelan organizations, Venezuelan securities being bought, traded, or exchanged in the United States. My view is that that's probably further down the road for the Biden administration. My guess is what they will be trying, what they think they want in the short term are partially lifting sanctions that will send a positive signal to the Maduro government, if you will, administration, and at the same time, kind of put maybe some people back to work, being the sort of thing that they can then defend from a democratic political base, both in Congress and more generally. And I suspect the securities ban, it will be fairly far back on their list of priorities, but we'll see who chooses to go to court in order to make the argument that the administration has already opened the door on sanctions, and they cannot now discriminate against us under the same sanctions regime just because, and then they'd have to finish that argument. Resuming flights. May I tell you right now, I would argue that the principal problem for why there's no flights between Venezuela, direct flights between Venezuela and the United States, is not sanctions themselves. I think all the major U.S. carriers had stopped their flights to and from Venezuela before sanctions were imposed, and I think they did that because they could not. They had this gigantic Bolivar credit in Venezuela, and they could not get it converted into any sort of currency that gives them any value whatsoever. It's just like having a gigantic piggy bank in Caracas, but they can only spend that money in that incredibly prosperous and dynamic economy in Venezuela, and eventually Delta, United, and American. I guess United wasn't there. Delta and American, the big ones who were there, said, it's not worth it. At the end of the day, we're just losing money. The only good thing they could say was it cost them less in terms of buying their petroleum for their return flights, but in exchange for which they were getting absolutely no income whatsoever from the flights. And I'm guessing there's not a lot of pressure there. My guess is most of the major airlines are going to want to see what has changed structurally in terms of the Venezuelan financial system before they're going to be willing to risk, and it is a risk, to put infrastructure back on the ground in Caracas, and then to put their aircraft, their relatively expensive aircraft, in the zone where they can be seized by the Venezuelan government if it chooses to do so. Finally, reopening the embassy. Yes, my guess is that will be difficult for the Biden administration to do until they can point to some positive progress in the dialogue in Mexico. And that's well into next year at the earliest. I mean, there's a lot of complicating things here. There's the security issue. There's the issue of how expensive it's going to be to provide secure housing for embassy personnel that go back. There will be questions as to how much has the current Venezuelan government and their Cuban advisors, how much have they penetrated the embassy structure while we have been gone. I mean, we have maintained a security staff, but obviously it's a skeleton staff. Have they gotten in there? What have they done in there? What are we going to be able to do by way of business? Or will the entire communication system be compromised by what they have done? It would be roughly similar to what the United States did when we returned to Havana in the 1970s, I believe, the late 1970s. And it took us probably 10 years before we finally had the embassy building structured in a way that we could do regular embassy business. These are the sorts of questions that we're going to have to answer. And my guess is I wouldn't count on seeing anything, even people talking about that, for at least another 6 months. That's my view. I may be wrong. I thought the New York Yankees would win the 1964 World Series, but the Cardinals took them 4-2. So I have been wrong in the past, and I might be wrong this time as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We are coming to an end, but before we close it out, I'd like to pick your brain on what do you think would be a realistic outcome of this new approach by the Biden administration, and would it happen in a time frame that is acceptable, or are we looking that maybe everything keeps going on and we then have a new administration? So what's realistic in terms of expectations for this process is the core of the last question.
Yeah. First, I will offer my own opinion as to what I wish they would do, even though I acknowledge right up front that this is probably not what will happen. I wish they would reach an internal decision, which does not need to be communicated. I mean, governments do make decisiones reservadas, and they do not communicate them publicly all the time. And I wish the Biden administration would make a determination that Nicolas Maduro is not part of the solution to the lack of democracy in Venezuela. He is part of the problem. I wish they would make the determination at that point in time that therefore our strategic objective, while the long-term strategic objective is restoration of democracy, not to mention prosperity and security in Venezuela, that cannot happen so long as Nicolas Maduro remains firmly entrenched in power. If they would reach that conclusion, then everything else becomes tactical. Is dialogue still an important approach? Of course it is. Dialogue is infinitely better than almost all of the other alternatives. But dialogue, intelligent dialogue, where we understand, and presumably so would the Venezuelan opposition, understand that the outcome that we are looking for is a process that eventually leads to the departure of Mr. Maduro from office, maybe to be replaced by another Chavista, infinitely possible. I agree with those who say that the government after Maduro is likely to be a Chavista government. I think that's probably correct. I do not believe we're going to find a willingness to completely withdraw from any position whatsoever. But once you have established the principle that Maduro can be removed, it opens the door to making progress on other issues, legal issues, criminal issues, kleptocracy issues, economic and business issues, public health issues, refugee issues. There are plenty of issues. That's what I wish would happen. Second, what I think will happen is that the dialogue process will not collapse in a great explosion, but rather will eventually fizzle out, which in some ways is the worst possible outcome, because it means all sides will continue to argue the fiction that we still have a dialogue going on. And the Maduro government will say, well, the dialogue hasn't been terminated. We haven't talked for the last 6 months, but the dialogue is still there. The opposition would say there is no real dialogue. And as we said all along, you cannot have a genuine dialogue or negotiation with Nicolas Maduro. The Biden administration will be in the trap that they have invested so much in the dialogue process. They cannot nearly then stand up and say the dialogue process has collapsed. And some of the key governments, I predict, not Mexico so much, but Colombia, Brazil, maybe Chile, and even Argentina will all be in a sense of saying the dialogue is not completely dead. We must keep going at it. And it's the worst possible outcome because it just stretches out the torture, and it doesn't give you either a clear message that we must start something new now, or alternatively, I guess, we give up and we look for a non-dialogue type process. The third possibility, and I throw this to particularly some of the business people that are listening right now, and that would be if we get to what I call not the collapse point, but the fizzle point, where the dialogue has clearly lost its steam and its momentum, even though no one is saying that the dialogue is definitively over at this point, because no one wants to. No one wants to be held responsible for ending the dialogue. When it begins to fizzle, when it begins to die out, instead of a roaring flame, you have some embers in your fireplace. Is there a point at that moment where one could somehow try to engage the two sides and say, can we separate some economic issues, perhaps, from the overall dialogue process and see if we could get both sides to agree on how to get the economy going in some way that is credible? But credible means accepting that the Maduro administration is a kleptocracy that is completely penetrated by organized crime, and therefore anything that involves more economic activity is at risk of being stolen or at least skimmed off by the government. And the opposition would want to have some control as well as some benefits to come out of it. But is there a possibility when we get to this point that you could perhaps carve out a couple of exceptions to get something going? And if you could get the two sides maybe separate from Mr. Lopez Obrador and the Norwegian mediators to say we're willing to do this, my guess is that the European sanction holders, the Canadian and US sanctioners would be open if we could say the Democratic opposition wants this, the Maduro government wants this. We could perhaps think of carving out some sort of exceptions under whatever conditions that would work. Those are my three scenarios as to what might happen. My dream come true. The Biden administration actually develops a strategic objective. It is that Mr. Maduro must go in the route to returning to democracy, as the famous Roman senator Cicero often said, Cartagio delandum est, and I would like to say Maduro delandum est as the route to solution. I don't think that's going to happen. I wish it would. I do believe it is probably going to fizzle, and that is the worst possible outcome. I do hope, third possibility, if it does fizzle, smart people on both sides will realize that the reason there are now more than 8 million refugees from Venezuela, more than 25% of the population, more than any other nation in the world. The big driver on that is a dysfunctional, non-existent economy. If you cannot work, if you cannot earn a salary, if you cannot buy food and feed your family, if you cannot have running water in your home, if you have no electricity, of course you are going to flee the country. And the solution to all that is economic activity that allows people to have jobs and the infrastructure to come back. Will we get to that possibility? Here's the way I put it. I offered you three options. One, we decide Maduro has to go. The likelihood of that is less than 10%. Two, we have the negotiations fizzling but not completely collapsing. The likelihood of that is probably 75%. Finally, we try to, once it fizzles, we can carve out some sort of economic exception agreed by the opposition and by the Maduro kleptocrats. The possibility of that, I want to be optimistic. 20% maybe, 25%. If not, I don't see an end to this. I don't wish to be totally pessimistic, but that's the best optimistic assessment I can give you right now.
Okay. Well, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. We are now concluding today's event. We had more than 400 individuals registered for this event. So before we close it out, let me provide a warm thank you to Ambassador Brownfield. You have been very instructive and helped all of us to have a better understanding of what might be in the horizon for Venezuela. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Muchas gracias. Many thanks. See you next time.
See you next time. Bye-bye.